I loved reading about Greek mythology. I found it very interesting how the story told of gods and heroes and monsters. One of my favorite stories is about how Hercules defeated the Hydra. And the problem with the Hydra was that when Hercules first tried to attack it, when he cut off the head, 2 more grew back in its place. And unfortunately, the affirmative team's policy today is that Hydra. It will not solve the problem, but will only make it worse. And today we're going to see that through a couple of disadvantages, or first, reasons why if you pass the affirmative team's policy, it's not going to work in the real world. However, before we get to those, we're going to get a clarification. Clarification point, goal. Clarification point, goal. The affirmative team today has come and they've presented this goal of the United States' interests, and they said that they believe the negative team should uphold that goal. But the affirmative team today seems to not understand the entire point of a negative team, which is to prove that the affirmative team's policy doesn't work. We don't need to prove that the status quo works. We need to prove that their policy doesn't work. And what we're going to see today is that it doesn't. Now understanding that, let's get into a couple of disadvantages. Disadvantage 1, flawed philosophy. Disadvantage 1, flawed philosophy. When it comes to the affirmative team's plan, their entire plan is based off a flawed philosophy. Subpoint A, Lebanon is critical. Subpoint A, Lebanon is critical. Lebanon is critical to the United States. According to Bilal Sayab, he says it's important to know what the United States is trying to do and what it is up against in Lebanon. The United States is competing fiercely with Iran for influence over Lebanon's political identity and strategic orientation. Lebanon matters to the United States and the world because it is a rather unique place in the Middle East. A free, tolerant, and pluralistic society where Muslims and Christians live in peace. It also has a democratic system of government that, although imperfect, could inspire other mixed societies in the region seeking to end their domestic conflicts. If the United States loses the struggle for Lebanon, it will also be denied a major point of access to the Mediterranean, where Russia has established a strategic presence, and Iran will have uncontested outposts at Israel's northern border. This is why the fight for Lebanon is important. Bilal Sayab specifically says you should not vote for the affirmative team's plan. He is someone that, as the affirmative team recognizes, is educated on Lebanon foreign policy. But not only that, Sam now says we need to be clear-eyed about what would happen to Iran's influence in Lebanon if the United States were to walk away from the country's most popular institution and key partner in the campaign against the Islamic State. Who wins if we withdraw? The answer, as we're going to find out, is not only Hezbollah themselves, but also other countries who would be harmful to Israel.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. My name is Crosby, and today I will be addressing whether the Make America Safe Again Act's provision for the indefinite detention of illegal entrants into the United States of America violates the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. And today the petitioner believes that it does. However, before we specifically address that question, we need to understand the facts pertaining to Ms. Alvarez in the case at bar. Ms. Alvarez was born outside the United States, crossed the border many times to work, and was stopped by a border agent and asked for identification papers. When she didn't have them, she was detained. Ms. Alvarez has asked for a deportation hearing, and that has been granted to her. She has now been in detainment for over a year awaiting that hearing. It has not yet been scheduled. She has now asked for a bond hearing to see if she can work while awaiting that deportation hearing. However, because the bond hearing was not required under the Make America Safe Again Act, it was denied. Today, the petitioner believes that Ms. Alvarez has a right to due process. Secondly, the Make America Safe Again Act does not give her that right. And finally, when we look at the Matthews test, we see that Ms. Alvarez should have access to some form of due process. The first thing we need to understand is that Ms. Alvarez does in fact have a right to due process.
And what would be due process in this case? What time period are you suggesting?
Yes, Your Honor. Well, when we look at the case of Zidvitas v. Davis, we see that in that particular instance, the court noted that only 6 months was enough time to be reasonably necessary. However, when we're looking at the case of Ms. Alvarez, we're not saying it must specifically be 6 months, but we must go with what Zidvitas said and have at least some standard of being reasonably necessary. However, the government in this case does not have any such standard. Secondly, furthermore, when we look at Ms. Alvarez...
So, counsel, you're saying that if there was a date or a number or something in there, it would be, in your opinion, constitutional?
No, Your Honor. What we are saying is that it must have at least some standard of being reasonably necessary. So it doesn't have to specifically, well, actually, yes, Your Honor. The government would have to show at least some reasonable time restriction to hold Ms. Alvarez. It doesn't necessarily have to be 6 months, as it was for the specific example given in Zedvitas. However, as Zedvitas stated, any statute limiting an alien's detention must hold up to a standard of being reasonably necessary, and that is not so.
Isn't she there because she challenged the deportation in the first place? And isn't that like a criminal waiting results of appeal?
Well, Your Honor, the case Jennings v. Rodriguez stated that the civil confinement at issue and the pretrial confinement that calls for bail are in every relevant sense identical. So Ms. Alvarez's position would not be like parole or probation, but it would be more like bail in this instance. And that leads us, yes, Your
Counsel,
Honor.
wouldn't it be, she could actually just return where she came from, correct? It's not like a criminal matter where she's in a process. Couldn't she just say, hey, I don't want to contest this, or I don't want to go further, I want to go home?
Well, Your Honor, Ms. Alvarez could indeed say that she no longer wants to have this deportation hearing. However, what we see is that because Ms. Alvarez does, because she wants this due process hearing, and because she is in the United States because of it, she has access to those Fifth Amendment rights, and she has access to that due process.
But she could, in fact, go back to where she came from, correct?
Your Honor, she could in fact go back to where she came from, but then she would not get that deportation hearing. And because Ms. Alvarez believes that she does in fact have enough ability to have that deportation hearing in the first place, this court cannot simply say, well, she could go back to Mexico.
Why does she want deportation hearing when it appears that if it does proceed, she's probably going to be deported? So why not wait, go back, and then come back in legally?
Well, Your Honor, there are several reasons why Ms. Alvarez would like a deportation hearing. One of them is that one of the main reasons Ms. Alvarez was detained was because she didn't have proper documentation. However, the village that Ms. Alvarez lives in does not have any proper documentation at all. And so it is reasonable for Ms. Alvarez to believe that she may have at least some hope of having this deportation go in her favor. But the simple fact of the matter is, because this deportation has not been decided, Ms. Alvarez right now has a right to due process.
But if you were to let her out on bail or bond, how would you guarantee that she'd come back? She would just go right back to Mexico? What kind of processes would you put in place for that?
Yes, Your Honor. First off, the court cited many different alternatives that could possibly exist. And actually, when we look at the cost of those alternatives, we see that there are substantially less than what the government is currently doing so now. One example would be an ankle bracelet. And secondly, Your Honor, when it comes to Ms. Alvarez wants to enter the United States. She wants this deportation hearing to work. So it is very reasonable to assume that Ms. Alvarez would in fact follow the regulations of the bond hearing so that this deportation hearing could go in her favor.
How would she come up with the